let's bring in our panel here in our studio. Pepe Zhang is the Associate Director for China at the Atlantic Council Center for Latin America. Also with us, the author and journalist Max Blumenthal. Joining us from New York, Alejandro Velasco is an Associate Professor at New York University and a historian of modern Latin America. And Arthur Estopinan is the International and Public Affairs Chief with the Estopinan Group, a political consultancy company. He joins us from Mexico City. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for being with us. Alejandro Velasco, let me start with you. When we look at the big picture of the region, Foreign Policy magazine recently had a piece in which they said that there is anger over corruption, unaccountable political systems and political elites. And if we add to that the unmet expectations that was expected from the commodities boom, well, we have a pretty combustible mix in Latin America. What is your assessment of the region right now?
Yeah, to some extent that seems exactly right. It's hard to see Latin America, for instance, in an ideological landscape as a left-right divide, which is what we used to see over the last 20 years of left-wing governments, where there was a pretty strict kind of question as to how social justice was going to be carried out. But to some extent, the fact that many of those governments did not, in fact, bring about the changes that they promised, or that they actually carried through on some neoliberal policies that they had critiqued at the beginning, suggests that this is no longer a kind of ideological battle. And so it does have much more to do with these nuts and bolts issues of governability, of accountability. You have right-wing governments under protests, like in Chile and Colombia. You have left-wing governments, like in Bolivia. And so, yeah, it's a very combustible landscape, no doubt.
Pepe, do these issues that Latin America is facing right now transcend political differences?
I would agree with Alejandro's point. I think that politics certainly play a role in this, but it's helpful to look this beyond the political lenses and the ideological lenses. From an economic perspective, I would say that the region as a whole, while being a region with huge diversity and heterogeneity, a lot of countries in the region do share some common challenges on the economic front. The overall global environment is no longer as friendly as you had mentioned earlier. A decade ago, the commodity prices were much more higher, and this certainly had an effect on the commodity exporters in the region. And currently, we live in an environment where there's a significant amount of global trade tensions, which is also putting downward pressure on prices for metals that folks export.
Right.
And
because if we look at growth, GDP growth across the region, it's less than 1%. That's the average over the last 6 years, which has led to this fear that there could be another lost decade.
That's certainly part of it, and the IMF had downgraded their growth forecast for Western Hemisphere this year, almost slashing half of it from 1.4% to 0.6%. And as you said, on average for the past 5-6 years, that's not been a very impressive number. But looking beyond the top line, which is certainly concerning in a way, we're also seeing micro-level trends that are also concerning. We want to see more productivity growth in the region. Something we've seen the past few decades is that Latin America has not been able to expand beyond the productivity growth as some of the Asian countries and East Asian countries particularly have been able to do successfully, climbing up that value-added ladder production chain. And I think most of the growth that we've seen so far in the region came more from the labor expansion. And that is also concerning because the demographic dividends that the region has been seeing for the past decade is clearly wearing off. And going forward, we see other challenges coming through, the technological disruptions and globalization, although it hasn't really played out regionally as controversial as it has, for example, in the U.S. It certainly will catch up at some point, and that's something that regional governments and companies should be preparing for.
Arthur Estopinan, if we look at the early 2000s, even from 2010, we saw pretty good growth in Latin America thanks to the commodities boom. A lot of the economies were flourishing. We talk of the pink tide when many countries elected governments from the left. And wealth was being distributed through social programs to those on the bottom rungs. In fact, the UN tells us that 70 million people were lifted out of poverty between the year 2002 and 2014. But if we look now, what went wrong?
Well, the reality is, as my colleagues mentioned, if there is no upward mobility, social justice in these governments throughout Latin America, whether you're from a left government or you're from the right government throughout Latin America, there is a lot of discontent among the population. And with social media and media being so prevalent, things can get quickly out of control because people unite and they have this pent-up frustration, feeling of lack of upward mobility for themselves and their children, and this makes them protest, as we're seeing now in Chile, Colombia, Bolivia, and all throughout with the Western Hemisphere. The reality is that in a global economy, we need the student and the educational reform throughout Latin America so that these students can be prepared in the global economy for innovative programs that will allow them to compete in that global economy. Until that is the case, then this stagnation throughout Latin America will continue.
Max, we talked about the pink tide. Well, the pink tide has now drifted off. Recently, many countries in Latin America, we look at Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, there's been a turn to the right, the hard right in many instances. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is an ideological component here. And in many cases, even when there is social mobility in countries, if those countries are not fully aligned with the Washington consensus and the IMF agenda, they come under attack. The first government of the pink tide to fall was in Honduras under a coup, which was presided over by the US Department of State, by Washington. And Honduras's economy has suffered enormously after a period of growth where small business owners were doing well through the ALBA system that was flowing out of Venezuela. And so we've seen real minimum wages decrease by half. You've seen poverty increase massively while security spending's gone up in Honduras. Corruption is through the roof, and the government is essentially a narco dictatorship where the brother of the president's been indicted in a New York federal court. Washington doesn't care because they have Southcom there. They have IMF, structural readjustment policies taking place there. And so the upward mobility doesn't necessarily translate to stability. The same thing just happened in Bolivia, where the Washington Post, not exactly the friendliest paper to the Latin American left, concluded in October, right before the military coup that removed Evo Morales, that Bolivians are healthier, wealthier, living longer, and more equal than at any time in their history, and yet Morales was removed, and many of the military and police chiefs who oversaw it had been participants in US military and police exchange programs. So there was a US hand there, and the goal is to implement the same kind of IMF austerity policies that are sparking protests in Chile and in Colombia as well, where the real problem...
I'll get to you, Arthur. Just finish your thought there.
Yeah, just the real... In Colombia, there is a political issue there, and it's that that peace is tied to prosperity, and that Duque, in walking back the peace plan, is threatening the most vulnerable sectors of the population with massive poverty. 20% of the population feels that they live in extreme poverty in Colombia.
So Arthur, I mean, listening to Max there, Max sees an ideological component, a political component, if you like, that's partly responsible for what we see in Latin America right now.
No, I disagree with my colleague. Unfortunately, ALBA was a total failure. As we know, Venezuela is in a state of chaos and in a state of narco criminal activity. In Ecuador, President Correa is no longer in power. The people decided to vote for a more conservative government. In Bolivia, the people are tired of Evo Morales' government, and so they want a new president. So ALBA was a total and big failure. The reality is that these governments need to root out corruption and allow for young people to have an upward mobility and social justice. Not only the elite of Latin America deserve to be educated and be able to grow economically. Everyone needs to grow.
Okay.
And that's
Can
why
I
we see
take 15
these
seconds?
revolutions
Yeah,
throughout Latin America.
Max, quick response, then I'm going to move on. Go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad Alejandro brought up Ecuador because
Arthur.
I'm glad Arthur brought up Ecuador because you saw a president, Lenin Moreno, run as the successor of Rafael Correa and immediately turn towards the IMF austerity agenda. And now we've seen massive protests, brutal repression. Moreno was forced from the capital, and ultimately, his hand was forced. So we saw an uprising against the IMF austerity agenda imposed by Washington.
I agree with you with the IMF. That is not fair with their policies to be implemented.
All right, I want to move
agree
on.
with you.
Alejandro, let's look at Brazil. Deep ideological and political divisions in the country. It is polarized, and then, of course, in Brazil, you also have a chaotic Congress, ruling coalition that is very difficult to organize. How difficult does it make it for a government to implement reforms in that kind of environment?
Extremely difficult, but I think one of the challenges that social movements on the ground are facing is precisely not only this confluence of economic crisis, but also the lack of leadership that would effectively oppose some of the policies that Bolsonaro has moved forward. For instance, one of the things he was able to push through Congress was what in other contexts would have been a very controversial pension reform plan that in other parts of Latin America have elicited huge amounts of protests. And so there's a way in which I think Bolsonaro has been able to move along some of this more reactionary agenda precisely because social movements that previously had been highly mobilized have not been so much over the last year, certainly two. So yeah, I think that makes the governance issues a little bit more attenuated for people like Bolsonaro. Of course, it also means that policies are being implemented that are extremely injurious to the environment, to the elderly, to those who require significant assistance on the part of the state. So that is driving some of the possibilities for reform in a place like Brazil.
Pepe, and if we look at Argentina, Argentina elected a right-wing government, Mauricio Macri, in 2015, but just recently denied him a second term. The Peronistas are back in power. Macri was widely seen to have failed to have delivered on his economic promises. Can the Peronistas fix it?
It's an interesting question because, again, very different countries in the region, but in Argentina, again, we're facing very difficult economic situations, economic decisions, but also at the same time, the politics seems to get in the way for the country to really get together and be able to move forward in unity. In the specific case of this upcoming government, we're hoping for a orderly transition so that the economic issues and the political issues and technical issues will be handed over in an orderly way. And also, it seems like the Alberto Fernandez government so far, publicly at least, has been very vocal about the importance of macroeconomic stability. We'll have to wait and see what are the specific measures that will be put in place. But so far, the interactions we've had and what we've heard from the government is that they want to have an international vision. They recognize the importance of the international community for Argentina going forward.
Arthur, we're also seeing some ideological fault lines in Latin America. The Brazilian foreign minister recently says Brazil may leave Mercosur, that's the grouping of South American countries. He cites the example of Argentina, which he says has a very different view of Mercosur. Are we beginning to see cracks in the region?
Well, I think that, speaking of Argentina, they also had issues with the IMF requirements in order for them to continue borrowing the funds that they needed to become solvent. Argentina has many natural resources, vast natural gas and oil in the Vaca Muerta region and others. The problem is that the IMF policies have really handhold the arms of the President Macri, and he wasn't able to communicate well the technical issues that the transition that Argentina was going to from a more stringent economic policy to hopefully economic growth.
Max, if we look at Brazil, President Jair Bolsonaro, he also threatened to leave Mercosur, and that was last August. That's because he didn't like what was going on in Venezuela and in Bolivia. I mean, what do you make of these differences that they have? Ideological differences, really.
Differences between
between Jair Bolsonaro and the other two countries that I mentioned, Venezuela and Bolivia?
Well, you know, Bolsonaro is riding a very strong right-wing constituency in Brazil that doesn't necessarily exist in all the countries, and I think it's maybe not the right approach to paint a broad brush. I mean, he has the Christian right in Brazil is extremely strong. You don't have an evangelical movement like that right now in Venezuela and in many of these other countries, and this is a long-term project. The Brazilian military has always been a major factor going back to the junta, and then the agriculture industry, the 3 Bs, Bible, bullets, and beef, brought Bolsonaro to power. In Venezuela, you have a very different picture, and but it's equally polarized. And I think one of the key points here and why we haven't seen a successful coup in Venezuela, or as we saw one in Bolivia, is that the military under Hugo Chavez was reformed and is essentially loyal to the Bolivarian revolution. Same thing in Nicaragua, where
They're
coup was
narco
defeated.
traffickers.
One moment,
The
Arthur. I'll get
generals
to you,
are
Arthur.
narco-traffickers.
I seem to be agitating Arthur a lot, but I just wanted to go back to my.
Because I'm
well, let me go
educating
back
us
to my
the
original.
Yeah, I'll
reality
get
of
to you,
what's
Arthur.
going
I'll
on
give
in
you a
the
chance to
region.
respond in a moment. Go ahead, Max.
My point is just to go back to politics and ideology, which is that a strong economy and upward mobility doesn't always guarantee stability for a country. So if you look at Nicaragua, there's an economic success story there as well under the Sandinista government, where even the World Bank in 2017 found in its report that the Sandinistas had made enormous progress in infrastructure, in cutting poverty, in increasing women's participation.
Right.
And yet in 2018, civil society groups funded by the United States, USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, embarked on a coup attempt. And Nicaragua's growth, its GDP was reduced from 5% to 0.
All right. Arthur, go ahead.
So in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, I agree with you absolutely that the GDP was growing at 4 to 5%. But when Mr. Ortega started killing over 400 young Nicaraguan students, then the people said, no more, we want you out of here.
That's not factual.
Come on,
that's not factual, Arthur.
That's a reality. So he has
be
killed
free-
over
he
400
can- you can
people.
be free to
you
disagree,
tell the
but-
mothers of those students who he has killed that their children are not dead. Give me a break. Open your eyes and see the reality of what's going on. In Venezuela, you have narco generals that are trafficking in that's why.
Okay.
Give me a break.
All right, Arthur.
Face the reality. That is the reality of what's going on.
Let's give Max a chance to respond. Go ahead.
The protests in Nicaragua began, ironically, over a social security reform in which Ortega's government was bucking the IMF in order to preserve, for example, public health care. It was completely paradoxical. There was no killing of 400 students. In fact, at least half of those killed, and the number is closer to 180, were Sandinistas. And unlike Arthur, I actually was in Nicaragua during and after the coup and interviewed the family members of people who were tortured and killed by a very violent right-wing opposition, which has shattered that country's economy. And this is also a country that's the safest country in Central America, which is a big factor in its economic
Ortega is a
picture.
dictator.
Okay, I want to
And
move
people
on.
want him
All
out.
right, Arthur, I want to move on. Alejandro, something that we haven't talked about yet and something that we don't hear a lot about, and that is the fate of indigenous peoples in Latin America. The indigenous group CONAE in Ecuador, they've taken to the streets to protest big disparities in economic development in urban areas compared to rural areas. They've also complained about discrimination, marginalization as well. We've seen similar demonstrations in Bolivia. How big an issue is this?
It's enormous, and it's one that is going to become even larger over the next few months in places like Bolivia. One of the things that we've seen in the wake of the coup is precisely a devaluing of indigenous symbols, of indigenous peoples, a targeting of indigenous populations, either as being bought off by Evo Morales and his party, or as dupes of some sort of external power. But in places like Ecuador as well, as you mentioned, and places like Brazil, where indigenous populations have been really targeted as a result of Bolsonaro's policies towards encroaching further and further into the Amazon region, what we're seeing is precisely this renewed mobilization around indigenous issues. The challenge is that, it's also very hard to think about indigeneity in Latin America in homogeneous terms. there are significant fractures among indigenous populations. Conaye is certainly a very powerful group in Ecuador, but there are others that are more aligned with more conservative sectors of the population. Some of them, perhaps, as Max was mentioning, the evangelical communities, right? So it's the landscape throughout the region is one where it's extremely hard to speak in broad brushes, and that is something that I think is unusual for analysts of the region who are more accustomed to think in terms of, neat either ideological or identitarian politics. We're seeing a very convulsed environment where those old categories are not so much holding sway.
Pepe, if we look at Chile, we've seen weeks of demonstrations there, demonstrations that have got very violent. There's been a very harsh crackdown by the state on demonstrators. But if we look at Chile, according to the World Bank, 1% of the country holds 1/3 of the wealth in that country. How does one change that?
A very good question. I think the Chile situation came as a surprise to me, and I think to many people as well, because Chile has long been considered as a reference point in terms of economic and democratic stability in the region.
Yeah.
So this came as a surprise, but it also, I think, reinforces the point that a few of my colleagues have mentioned, that we have to look at how the wealth distribution is being carried out in a lot of Latin American economies. Chile has had, relatively speaking, more stable and impressive top-line growth, but sometimes something we've observed is that within that, the gains that have been derived from that economic growth has not been distributed in a very effective way or a broad-based way that it could be. I think the protest spoke to that. It started with the hike in metro fare, but it goes way beyond that. It was the tip of an iceberg. It goes into the pension system. It goes into the education system. And to our colleague's earlier point, there's something about upward mobility and how that is carried out, and that is important across left and right-wing governments. And something we've seen, for example, is that across different governments and ideologies in the region, there's something that we can definitely do better in terms of spending more and spending better money to make sure that public expenditure is actually getting to the places that will boost the long-term economic competitiveness of the countries. And hopefully the countries in the region will take these protests, really listen to the people, take it as an opportunity to undertake some of these structural reforms that are so much needed in the countries.
And we have to leave it there. Time has caught up with us. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.